I want to take you back to when I was 11 years old and this trailer came on.
I knew it was too early to promote you.
Well, I understand double O's have a very short life expectancy.
I remember the discourse around Daniel Craig at the time, the thoughts about his hair, his look, the way people debated if he could even live up to the so-called lesser Bond actors, only for it to release and be maybe the best Bond movie ever?
Vodka martini. Shaken or stirred?
Do I look like I give a damn?
So now with his successor up in the air, every single movie site on planet Earth has run a story with their theories, cast lists, top 10s, and the never-ending argument that they should cast Idris Elba, despite him being only 5 years younger than Daniel Craig. But it matters so much less to me who plays the next James Bond than who directs the next James Bond. And I'll tell you why. Pierce Brosnan had maybe the best Bond debut since Sean Connery, with everyone's favourite of his movies, GoldenEye, directed by this guy, Martin Campbell. It truly pushed the franchise to its most iconic, partly because it has one of the best villains, almost certainly because it has one of the best Bond performances, and then there's that other reason.
We both agreed you couldn't use Oddjob. He's too short, he's impossible to shoot.
So 20 years later, creatively spurred by Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and Paul Greengrass's Bourne Supremacy, the Bond producing partnership of Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson have a mission. Make Bond modern again, make him sexy, and make it feel fresh. What Nolan did for Batman and what Bourne did for the spy genre, they wanted to do for Bond. A whole new energy, a whole new experience, a fresh, edgy approach. So who did they hire to direct it? The director of GoldenEye, Martin Campbell. At 62, Campbell was the oldest director to helm a Bond movie. Between GoldenEye, he had made the two Antonio Banderas Zorro movies, the K2 rescue movie Vertical Limit, and an adventure drama about humanitarian aid workers Beyond Borders. So why did they return to Campbell? Well, actually, they had offered him first right of refusal on every Bond film since GoldenEye. Campbell only chose to do Royale because it was a chance to develop an entirely new Bond from the ground up, like he had with Brosnan, and it was based on the first Fleming book, so there was a deeper well of character to draw from. But why did they hire Campbell for GoldenEye? As is common with big budget properties, the best director for the job is usually not the first choice. John Woo, Peter Medak, and Michael Caton Jones were all considered, but ultimately they chose Campbell because of his exceptional TV directing work on the show Edge of Darkness, which he later remade as a feature film starring Mel Gibson. But what made Campbell so special? Why was he different from the other Bond directors who worked with Brosnan? And why did the Bond producers choose him to help the franchise? Well, as crazy as it seems now, James Bond was not a hot property in 1995. It had been 8 years since License to Kill, and in that time, the Berlin Wall had come down, the Soviet Union had ended, and Bond was looked at as sort of redundant.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War.
Everyone was feeling that it might be over. There were things in the press about it being past its sell-by date and finished and a relic, and not relevant to the 1990s and all that sort of shit. The main story of that film was, what is going to happen now? Of course, things got pretty bad. So I think Pierce's Bond reflected the changing world order and the need more than ever for the heroic endeavour. Plus, there was unexpected pressure on the film's budget. We had $55 million to produce the movie, which was extraordinarily low, so there was a lot of financial pressure. For reference, the budget of Die Hard with a Vengeance, which would go on to be the highest grossing film of the year, was $90 million. The schedule was also very rushed, filming from January 1995 to June 1995.
Believe it or not, we have 18 weeks, but it's a very tight 18 weeks. In fact, any film you do, it's never enough time, and my last film was 12 weeks, this is 18, you would think it'd be enough.
Allowing just 5 months of post-production before release, which maybe explains why some parts of the film aren't that polished. But it paid off. GoldenEye was the third highest grossing film of the year worldwide. But before we go any further, we've got to answer an important question. Why do directors matter? Like me, you probably grew up thinking that 3 people were responsible for creating the James Bond movies. Ian Fleming, Sean Connery, and the original producer of all the Bond films, Albert Cubby Broccoli. The Bond films have always been Broccoli Productions, his daughter Barbara taking over from GoldenEye onwards. While the films have continued through different actors and drifted further from Fleming's source material, the producers have always partnered with directors whose takes on Bond never go too far from the formula. Plus, there's an obvious joy these directors have in making a Bond film in the Bond style. It's exciting and scary. You know there's a huge audience out there, and you have to deliver certain elements. Those elements include the style of the film, the swagger of Bond, the The girls, the one-liners, the gadgets. As a director, you want to leave your finger marks on it, but you have to accept that certain things are expected of you. But who created that style? Well, to know that, we need to look at the first Bond director, a man whose life in and of itself could have been a movie, Terrence Young. Born in 1915 in Shanghai to Irish parents, Young served in the British Army in World War II, where he rose to the rank of captain and fought in the disastrous Operation Market Garden, where in just 10 days close to 15,000 Allied lives were lost. Afterwards, Young found himself in a Dutch hospital being nursed back to health by volunteers, one of whom was a young Audrey Heenstra, who later became better known as Audrey Hepburn. Post-war, he became a screenwriter and eventually a director. In the 1950s, he made several films with Albert Broccoli, who was fixated on acquiring the rights to a book written by a British author, also a veteran of World War II, called Ian Fleming. After realizing it would be too hard to acquire the rights for Thunderball, Broccoli settled on adapting a television concept Fleming had been shopping around, called Dr. No. And after Guy Green, Guy Hamilton, Val Guest, and Ken Hughes turned down the job, Broccoli offered the directing gig to Terrence Young, who would go on to direct not only Dr. No, but also From Russia with Love and Thunderball.
I'm glad I killed him.
You're glad.
Got it! Bloody good. No, I know, but it's all right. You all right, Sean? Bloody good.
The reason he didn't direct Goldfinger is because he was busy directing the thriller Wait Until Dark, starring Audrey Hepburn, more than 20 years after she helped him recover from his injuries. As an aside, Wait Until Dark is a really great thriller. Give it a watch. But the true great directing decision of Terrence Young, long before cameras ever rolled, was picking Sean Connery as James Bond. But he didn't just cast him. According to several sources, Young made Sean Connery into James Bond.
You have to remember that Sean was a pretty rough diamond at that time. And Terrence taught him everything he knew.
I think he really sort of coached Sean how to be James Bond. He had a maximum amount of style.
He had an enormous influence on creating James Bond.
Peter Hunt, the editor of many of the Bond films, who would later direct the debut of Connery's successor, claims that Young taught Connery everything. What to say at dinner parties, what wine to order with which meal, how to move elegantly.
Every director puts his stamp on a film. Every director, some of his personality, if sometimes not all of his personality, comes off in a film.
His main influence was creating the Bond character.
If James Bond appeared sophisticated and refined, that's because Terrence Young was. Young moved only in the finest places, wore expensive suits, and drank only the best champagne.
We had a yacht. They rented a yacht on which we would go between takes. When we had to work on a beach, they would have tents. Champagne would be there and the best of wine. That was Terrence anyway. That was his style and that was the way that things were done. So I worked on rougher pictures, but Thunderball was definitely the easiest.
Late in pre-production, when Connery was almost ready to make his debut, Young took Connery on a lunchtime trip into downtown London to his own tailor on Savile Row. It was time for Connery to put on the suit, as it were. By the time Connery showed up for his first day of filming, Young had changed everything about him. Connery no longer talked with his hands, one of Young's most infamous pet peeves. Connery was already far from being a bad actor, but Young knew how to make him shine, and he did. He had turned Connery into a gentleman, and then turned that gentleman into an icon. Terrence Young never had a film made about his life, but James Bond as we think of him is much closer to Terrence Young than Sean Connery, or even Ian Fleming's written version of the character.
Terrence was the director that set the sort of style of it.
And he saw himself as James Bond.
Terrence Young was James Bond. He was the glamour.
Connery's model will always be the thing to which every other Bond actor is compared to, and that model was firmly set by Terrence Young. All this is to say, whoever takes on Bond inherits the legacy of 6 actors and 12 directors. But if you go back to the source, the thing that was most important, and is still most important, is that sense of character. A good director will navigate obstacles while trying to preserve a sense of tone and character. A great director will take on something that could easily be silly or false. Like a story about a secret agent who goes everywhere in 3-piece suits, driving a sports car, while telling his name to everyone he meets.
Just a new banker, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
into something that feels believable and even emotional. An easy way to show this is by looking at what happens when someone who isn't a great actor plays James Bond. Can you still make a great movie out of it? Now, before anyone jumps to the comment section, I love George Lazenby. I love his Bond. I love that he can't quite shake his Australian accent.
This never happened to the other fella.
And I love how he fights and the way he looks. Lazenby, with the exception of Connery, looks the most like he could handle himself in a fight before heading to a casino to meet a rich billionaire for dinner. I cannot believe that in this performance, he is the same age as I am now. But let's be honest, Lazenby is almost by default the worst Bond actor. Partly because he wasn't even an actor. He managed to get a hold of a suit from Sean Connery's tailor, get the same Rolex and haircut as Connery, and just managed to convince the Bond producers and Peter Hunt to meet with him. He lied through the meeting that he had wide acting credits and got a screen test, only to end up confessing to Peter Hunt that he had made it all up and wasn't really an actor. The story goes that Peter Hunt laughed and told him, "You just strolled in here and managed to fool two of the most ruthless bastards in the industry. You're an actor." The whole story of how he became Bond is priceless, and you should go and watch the documentary Becoming Bond, because it's superb and really funny.
You got to change his accent. So it wasn't, "My name's Bond, James Bond, 007.
You give us a martini, shake it, stir it, I don't care, I'll drink anything.
But Lazenby isn't the reason On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a great Bond film. Peter Hunt is. Peter Hunt had edited the first 3 Bond films, and he pushed to direct You Only Live Twice, but after he was denied, he left the franchise behind and took a world-round trip, only to run into Albert Broccoli and director Lewis Gilbert by accident in Tokyo. Broccoli asked Peter Hunt on the spot to come back and direct Second Unit, with the understanding that if he did a good job, he could direct On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So for his first ever time in the director's chair, Peter Hunt did the impossible and made a successful Bond film without Sean Connery. It's hard to overstate how radical this was for the time. If Majesty had failed, it's likely we would never have gotten the passing of the torch from actor to actor we love to this day. Guy Hamilton and John Glenn respectively handled Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton's debut, but both of them had directed films of the previous Bond actors before taking the reins, which makes Terrence Young, Martin Campbell, and Peter Hunt the only directors to ever handle the first appearance of a James Bond actor as their first Bond film. It's also worth noting, in my opinion, that all 3 of them have the most iconic reveals of 007, which could just be because they're talented, but also because it can be argued that they had something to prove. Terrence Young with the famous Baccarat scene in Dr. No where his face isn't revealed until Connery lights his cigarette, with the theme playing in sync with his name being stated for the first time.
Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
In Majesties, Peter Hunt directs a fantastic scene where Bond saves Tracy from drowning herself, almost completely in silhouette, before introducing her and us to George Lazenby's 007.
Good morning. My name's Bond. James Bond.
But Martin Campbell's 2 Bond introductions are exceptional, and particularly notable for how distinct they are. While GoldenEye has the incredible dam jump sequence, with Bond being introduced mid-action with a quippy line and a right hook,
"Beg your pardon, forgot to knock."
Casino Royale introduces a Bond that lives in shadows, not trying to show off, but able to hold a quick conversation to find out as much as he can before doing what he needs to. But this is also intercut with Bond making what is understood to be his first kill. Like GoldenEye, it's in a bathroom, but this time it is brutal, violent, and genuinely unpleasant, and Bond doesn't have anything funny to say once the job is done. With Campbell, we clearly have someone who knows how to do Bond with a classical edge, while still making the action exciting and contemporary, both in the action escapist spectacle of the 90s and the post-9/11 paranoia of the 2000s. Several of Casino Royale's action scenes are up there with the all-time greats. The Parkwell construction site chase, the airport sabotage attempt, the iconic Aston Martin roll that broke a world record, which was only beaten by Fall Guy last year. These are beats of action that rank as some of the best Bond moments. So the biggest question is, will Martin Campbell return? He is 80 years old now, and recently expressed that he thinks he is much too old to do another Bond film, but would love to be asked and would consider it. I mean, George Miller is 1 year younger than him. I'd back Campbell's chances of making lightning strike a third time. But let's assume he passes, or the producers go in a new direction. Who genuinely has a chance at not just being the next Bond director, but a great Bond director? I know everyone online loves to say Christopher Nolan for some reason. Or people suggest Denis Villeneuve or Ridley Scott, but the truth is that the Bond franchise has never been a comfortable place for visionary directors. The closest it has come to working is Sam Mendes, and part of the reason he himself credits Skyfall with being as good as it was, similar to Campbell, were financial problems. MGM had gone bankrupt, which meant the production had to shut down, and he and the writers had time to refine the script into better shape. These movies are very difficult to write. Those 10 months of downtime on Skyfall, that's when the script really turned around, because we had the time to go down blind alleys and try things, and that time was not afforded to me when we made Spectre, and you can see the differences in the script. As much as I love the idea of Lynn Ramsey or Luca Guadagnino tackling Bond, it seems like these films are highly organized chaos machines that only certain filmmakers can survive creatively. It's interesting that after Terrence Young, the producers would mix it up with some homegrown talent. Both Peter Hunt and John Glenn began working on Bond as editors before directing, and complete newcomers to action films like Lewis Gilbert. My first thought was, what the hell am I going to do? There had been 4 very good films before me, and how do I make it any different? I had a long talk with Cubby, and he said, "Oh, I'm sure you'll find a way of making it a bit better or a bit different." And I had already made 10 or 12 films, so I was fairly confident I could do something with it. And that is what most Bond directors have done, made things a bit better or a bit different. It's fascinating that the same formula for choosing directors who have limited action experience seems to have been a consistent decision ever since the 5th Bond movie. Danny Boyle, one of the most iconic and established British directors of all time, left the last Bond movie after not wanting to fire his longtime writer John Hodge, replacing him with the producers' established Bond writing team of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. I remember thinking, should I really get involved in franchises? Because they don't really want something different. They want you to freshen it up a bit, but not really challenge it, and we wanted to do something different with it. Unfortunately, Danny's crazy madcap ideas didn't quite tie up with what Barbara and Michael wanted. It was definitely a good thing to do, maybe another time though. I'm revving Barbara up to have another go with Danny. He had some extraordinary ideas, they just needed a little pulling together.
He knows a lot about Sean Connery. That's hardly a substitute.
The next Bond director, like the next Bond, should be someone unexpected. Someone who can manage a large production like a TV show or a miniseries with a great sense of character and personality. Someone who doesn't seem like they'll shake the boat, but can still drive home an exceptional piece of work. It shouldn't necessarily be someone who screams that person is an action movie director either. Remember that Martin Campbell hadn't made GoldenEye until he made GoldenEye. So here are some of my thoughts on interesting European filmmakers who could take on Bond. Anil Karai is a name not many people know, but he has been making beautiful work for years and won the Oscar for Best Short Film in 2022 for his collaboration with Riz Ahmed, The Long Goodbye. But the reason I'm pushing him is for his work on Top Boy. While Top Boy could be dismissively called the British version of The Wire, the way the show builds with interesting double crosses and tense showdowns is deeply satisfying, and Anil's direction of the season 3 finale is superb and is rightly recognised as the highest rated of the entire show. However, at only 40, he would be the youngest Bond director ever, beating out Cary Fukunaga. But even younger and more risky would be Rose Glass, writer-director of Saint Maud and Love Lies Bleeding. I doubt the Bond producers would take on someone so young, and for some reason they seem to avoid writer-directors, but Rose Glass would bring a creative freshness that I'd love to see. Plus, it's extremely overdue for a Bond film to be directed by a woman, so why not someone who knows how to play with the erotic thriller genre? French director Thomas Vincent is one of the most adept TV directors today, with some of the best episodes of The Bodyguard and Reacher to his name. In Bodyguard in particular, his handling of geography, space, and tension within the action is exceptional, and it's a huge reason why that show became so popular. Seeing his set-piece designs for Bond would be wonderful. I know I said that action isn't everything, but what the producers saw in Martin Campbell's TV work on Edge of Darkness, I can definitely see translating to Vincent's work on Bodyguard. In the more unusual but still prestigious tier, we have British director Steve McQueen, whose incredible dramas Hunger and Shame, followed by 12 Years a Slave, made him one of the most successful independent filmmakers critically, and while his action thriller Widows disappointed many, I think it shows the range he has for turning a fresh perspective on violence and tension. In his hands, we would not only potentially have one of the most beautiful Bond films ever made, his frequent cinematographer Sean Bobbitt is an absolute master of crafting beautiful images, but someone who can create a new evocative tone for what may end up being the first non-white Bond actor to step into. But my number one choice would be Swedish director Johan Renck, whose work on Chernobyl seems like a real no-brainer. His ability to work with great actors on dense material with the backdrops of a huge world-shaping event, and still find moments of calm and humour, speaks volumes of how he would be able to shape something as unreal as Bond, giving it a sense of weight and passion. But in all honesty, we'll just have to wait and see. As much as I love the idea of Lynn Ramsey or Luca Guadagnino tackling Bond, it seems like these films are highly organised chaos machines that only certain filmmakers can survive creatively. That only certain filmmakers can survive creatively. So, I had this video finished. I was done. I was about to hit upload on the final version. But I couldn't stop thinking about Luca. Luca Guadagnino is one of the best directors working today. His sense of nuance and characterization, his aesthetic choices, his obvious love of genre cinema make him one of the most interesting filmmakers alive. And he would be the best director to helm the next Bond film. Not only would he be the first Italian director of the franchise, he would also be the first gay director. At least, that's what I thought. Peter Hunt, the director of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, while never publicly confirming his sexuality, lived with his partner Nikos Kortis from 1975 until his death in 2002.
But darling, now we have all the time in the world.
Looking at Peter Hunt's legacy on the franchise and how Luca could fit into it, we have to acknowledge that the Bond films have always had this somewhat unspoken metrosexual, if not outright homoerotic energy. And I'm not talking about recent Bond, I'm talking about from the very beginning. The only reason I discounted Luca is because he seemed like a risky artistic choice. But that's me trying to think like a Hollywood executive and not as a creative producer, which for all you can say about the Bond movies, Barbara and Michael clearly are. I don't think they would want their next Bond to be handled by someone who will struggle to get a vision across. I think for the first film of a new actor, they would want someone who it's fairly clear could make a film that captures the spirit, energy, and fun of classic Bond. And the person I think is the best for that is Luca Guadagnino. The Bond films tend to alternate between going too silly and then too bleak or ordinary. Luca is the guy who could make Bond feel fun again. Having him helm the debut of the next actor would not only give us a Bond that feels sexy, which we've been lacking since Casino Royale, but also a Bond that can be that little bit exaggerated without going over the top. He is currently working on his next film Queer, starring Daniel Craig, so there's potential for a meeting with the Bond producers off the back of a recommendation. Craig was also responsible for bringing Sam Mendes on board, so his word clearly carries weight. Like with the next Bond actor, I do not want to lose any of the amazing original films that Luca Guadagnino would make in the years it takes for a Bond film to be made. But I do greedily want to see his take, more than anyone else I've said. So that's it. I think Luca Guadagnino should be the next Bond director. Now back to my wrap up, where I look completely different. But in all honesty, we'll just have to wait and see. But I do think this topic is interesting because if there's one thing the Bond films are fascinating to study, it's how they have managed to keep being successful in spite of a changing world, cultural attitudes, and audience taste. Whenever someone thinks, what's the difference between a movie and a film, you couldn't find a clearer example than Bond. You know exactly what to expect, and yet it still needs to entertain you throughout. But at the end of the day, there is one constant that each film has to get right. The thing you have to hang on to, despite the complicated logistics, is that you want to make a character film. Yes, it's going to have endless action, but at the heart of it, people go because they like Bond. There are always special effects movies that will have more or bigger action scenes, more of this or more of that. But if you get it right, and you get this odd, entertaining English character at the center of it, then it works. Sure, the films have big stunts, beautiful women, exotic locations, and dastardly villains trying to rule the world. But in the end, they always come down to one man.
Bond.
My name's
Bond.
Bond. My name's Bond.
James Bond.
I cannot wait to see who the next Bond is, and find out who will be directing their introduction. But in the meantime, can we please get a decent remaster of GoldenEye? Both GoldenEyes.
Slappers only. For England, James.
I'm Byron Wilder, and thank you for watching.